Mrs. Plank, or Nushi if I may, as a former student of yours, I've been a recipient of so much of your wisdom and been witness to your philosophy as it applies to children and child life. I know that the impact goes so much further. What were the influences in your life that led to your concern for children and that later did evolve into the profession of child life?
Well, I grew up in a typical apartment, as practically all Viennese children did, with the exception that my mother fled to the country as soon as we possibly could get away from school or be out. And there was are my really good childhood memories. I remember how I learned how to swim at age 5. My mother taught me, who had just learned before that how to swim herself in order to teach me. So to show you how the relationship to nature and to do the physical things were important in my early childhood. I really grew up as a single child because my brother was born 7.5 years after me. And I think his being that much younger must have been quite a bit to do with my interest in becoming a teacher. I think from the early beginning he had, there was this relationship of the older sister or my little brother. And so these are, when school started and I was quite young, I had to take a special exam to be allowed to start school before I was 6. I got very, very involved in school. It was a typical school of the days, and I think it still exists this way now, that there were no boys in the whole schoolhouse. There were only girls, so there are boys' schools and girls' schools. But we had the advantage of having a school which was attached to a teacher training institution. And as we got a little older, we of course fell in love with some of the practice teachers. And that was, have some very good memories for me. And it also shows somehow the importance my parents paid to education. One had to pay for this school and one had to pay for my high school. And though that was not easy, my father was working for the government and the incomes were rather restricted, that was taken for granted. That I would have greater advantages in these schools than in others, and that was done.
And your father was an intellectual too.
Oh, very much so. And we joked, you know, and said, well, if once he retires, maybe he would like to become a Buddhist priest, because his reading and history and these things were of great importance for him.
After World War I, the experiences that you had even more clearly show your sensitivity to the needs of children. I know you mentioned one that your mother sought out right after World War I, a camp in Austria to send you to that was quite a unique experience.
That was unique. I don't think that people who live on this continent can really visualize what World War I meant to those who were in the midst of it. And I think Austria was probably worst hit because not only did the empire collapse, but from a country of 56 million emerged a country of 7 million. With beautiful mountains and lakes, but nothing to feed the population with. So these were difficult times and very trying times for mothers to see that their children had what they always wanted to give them. So when the opportunity arose when I was 13, that was a few months after the end of the war, to send me to a summer camp where at least the mountain air would be as it used to be. She took advantage of it, not knowing, as none of us did know, that this was really a milestone in the development of many of us, because it brought, I think, about 200 girls ages 13 to 18, as the high school years, with 20 boys who were handpicked. They were usually older. I mean, the youngest I remember was between 15 and 16. So you can imagine that I was on the lowest level. I was 13. There was no chance to be even interested in any of the boys. There were much better objects for that. But there were some very unusual people there. For instance, Rudolf Serkin, who is certainly known to many people today
Certainly.
as a pianist, was one of the boys.
Mm-hmm. This really was your first group experience.
Yes, very much
Yeah.
so.
Then she later, really while you were still quite a young teenager, sought out another experience, and that was your stay in Sweden and going to school in Sweden.
Yes, and that again was the outcome of the war, and that I want to stress, the breakdown of everything that existed before. Was miserable for our elders, but it offered us an opportunity of consciousness of what lay ahead and what needed to be done, which was probably beyond our years. And
much.
I was 14 when I came to Sweden. Sweden, along with other neutral countries like the Scandinavian countries, Holland, Switzerland, had offered hospitality to Viennese children because it was really quite a problem to feed us. That was shortly, a little over a year after the end of the war, which was almost worse than the war years because the other parts of the monarchy became independent, so they didn't feel like sending the little foods they had to the capital.
Sure.
So my memories of Sweden are not only those of a typical 14-year-old who learns a language. For instance, that was the first time I really enjoyed learning a foreign language. I had studied French for a long time, but I never really felt that I knew French.
Yeah.
But living there, the language became part of our lives, and the songs and the folk dances and slöjd and whatever goes with Swedish education became very, very absorbing to us. And also, along with us, there were some university students there for the same reason, to pick up on their strengths. And I had one of my first idols, one biologist woman who was really set with, imitated her handwriting, all the typical adolescent things. Yeah. But we were intrigued by science through her, And when I came back at the end of 9 months, I was invited to stay longer, but I really wanted to be back and being able to continue with my own class and my own environment. When I came back, somehow Vienna looked very different. I had seen what a country without war and without aggression, or obvious aggression, could accomplish. And I came back with a very determined idea that I wanted to become an educator. And quite a few of the conflicts I had with my mother in adolescence came from this determination, which probably would not have developed if I had not been separated from the family.
Yeah.
So in a way, though I gave her some hard years, I think it was very good for me.
Yeah. She had other ideas, didn't she, when you returned, or at least offered another choice?
Yes, well, and she was probably very right from her point of view. While I was 15, no, I must have been 16 by that time, I got Maria Montessori's book into my hands. And in order to understand that, one has to say that there were no public libraries or no libraries for children. We had no school library. That means in order to read, one had either to belong to a private library club, which my mother belonged to, but I don't think they had children's books or any books which would interest me, or one had to own books, or one had to have friends who owned those books one didn't own, and one could exchange it. And so I got the Montessori book from a friend who had gotten it from another friend. And throughout my high school years, which were 6 years, I had a very intimate friend who lived close enough from us that we could really spend all our afternoons together. We had our French lessons, which were outside of school, to give us some chance to learn how to talk together. And I spent practically every afternoon with her. And she, in turn, spent the summer months when one couldn't leave Vienna with us, where we had a victory garden. And that again shows the initiative of my mother. You know, she took that initiative, and we had this victory garden, which we didn't do much work, but there was an old blind horse and a wagon, and we could just sit there and dream or help once in a while,
Sure.
but we didn't. So this friendship was a very intense one, and the two of us decided to look into the possibility to be accepted as apprentices at the Montessori school, of which we had just heard that it would open through a coincidence, through the older sister of my friends. And so we investigated it and got just thrilled at the opportunity it seemed to offer, and were received with pleasure, because there was no money to pay some trained people. So we 16-year-olds were received as trainees with the understandings that we would do some work. And the two of us were put in the kitchen. And luckily, the summer before, we had both been involved in leading a camp for 40 younger children in one of the most beautiful parts of Austria. Actually, it was a former castle, which at that point was what we would call a ruin. It had no more windows, and there was no electricity. It was, as it should be, on a hill above the valley in the Dolomites. It was really superb.
And you organized this camp pretty much on your own, didn't you?
Well, the two of us. And as a matter of fact, I don't understand really how the 40 parents trusted us. But evidently we were all so serious about it. And we had the help. And that I forgot to mention before. After I came back from Sweden, school seemed empty. There was something that was lacking in contact with people, and which my friend could not make up for. You know, it needed some broader base. And I don't know how I heard about it, but I heard about a group of youngsters who were under the leadership of the wife of, I think, one of the top Boy Scouts leaders in the city. And I went to that group, which was really very exciting, because all sorts of romance went on in terms of literature and music. The two Circan sisters were there. And again, it was again a select group, but only girls, of gifted, I shouldn't even say gifted, but of involved young people, some of them very gifted. And so I started out there and went to camp the year before we organized the camp. My friend was not there yet. She's joined in next fall.
Was there a sense of confidence and a sense of being able to accomplish something? Was that prevalent among many of the youth in Austria?
Very
at this
definitely.
time?
You know, if something collapses as completely as this monarchy had collapsed after the end of the war, and all the facilities of a state had to be rebuilt. In very simple terms, we felt the older generation had brought us in this mess, but we will lead out of it.
So you really had strength and really felt that you could master and do something for the...
At least we were optimistic enough to think that what we did mattered.